The annual Congressional Leadership Gala represented the pinnacle of Washington political society, an invitation-only gathering where senators, cabinet members and diplomatic elites convened to celebrate what the invitation called distinguished public service and civic excellence. My family had spent 18 months cultivating connections to secure tonight's coveted access to actual power. Absolutely not, Mom insisted firmly to the event coordinator, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to managing social disasters. Rachel cannot be seated with our party. She'll completely undermine the impression we're trying to create. The impression they were trying to create involved my father's recent appointment to the Federal Trade Commission's advisory board and my sister Diana's engagement to a deputy attorney general, achievements that had finally elevated them into Washington's inner circles of influence and access. Rachel's still struggling with presentation issues, Diana explained diplomatically to Senator Harrison's wife, who chaired the gala's planning committee. We felt it best to minimize potential complications during such an important political gathering. Presentation issues. At 27, my issues included wearing practical clothing instead of designer gowns and speaking directly about policy problems rather than engaging in the elaborate diplomatic language that characterized Washington's social conversations. Rachel means well, but she lacks understanding of how political networking actually functions, Dad added apologetically to Deputy Secretary Morrison, whose endorsement had secured his FTC position. These high-level events require sophisticated appreciation for protocol and appropriate professional behavior. While they pursued advancement through political cocktail parties and regulatory appointments, I'd been running Justice Analytics, a government transparency organization that used data analysis to expose corruption, track legislative voting patterns, and identify conflicts of interest in federal agencies. Diana's wedding will be such a wonderful addition to Washington's social calendar, Mom announced proudly to the assembled political elite. A deputy attorney general's wife needs to understand how to navigate these diplomatic complexities appropriately. Diplomatic complexities. Through the Kennedy Center service corridors, I made my way to the storage area where event staff had positioned me, close enough to observe the gala but far enough to avoid accidentally engaging with anyone whose vote or appointment might be influenced by my family's networking efforts. Rachel's always been idealistic about government reform, Diana was explaining to the EU ambassador's wife, her tone suggesting that advocacy work was admirable but ultimately naive. Big dreams about transparency and accountability, but not quite ready for serious policy implementation. Justice Analytics had exposed 17 congressional ethics violations this year, resulting in 3 resignations and 4 criminal investigations that recovered over $40 million in misappropriated federal funds. My phone buzzed with an urgent message from my research director, Senator Warren's office requesting immediate briefing on healthcare lobbying report. POTUS motorcade arriving early, wants consultation before gala speeches. POTUS consultation. What my family understood as their evening of political advancement was actually the preliminary meeting for tomorrow's Senate hearing on healthcare industry corruption. A hearing where my organization's research would be central to proposed legislative reforms. Rachel would be so overwhelmed by tonight's guest list, Mom observed with maternal concern. Real policymakers, actual government officials. Perhaps observing from a distance will help her understand how legitimate political influence actually develops. Legitimate political influence. In 20 minutes, they were about to discover exactly how legitimately influential the family member they'd hidden behind kitchen equipment had actually become. The gala's political networking exceeded my family's Washington aspirations beyond their most ambitious expectations. Diana had engaged in substantive conversations with 3 senators' wives and 2 cabinet members, while Dad had cultivated relationships with regulatory officials whose decisions could transform his advisory board position into serious governmental influence. Diana's understanding of legal policy has been quite impressive, the Attorney General's wife observed approvingly to my parents. She grasps the complexity of implementing justice reforms through established institutional frameworks rather than these disruptive approaches that ignore political realities. Justice Analytics had disrupted exactly those political realities by exposing how established frameworks often protected corrupt officials rather than serving public interests, But our research remained invisible to their understanding of sophisticated policy work. The key to effective government service is patience and respect for traditional processes, Dad explained authoritatively to the Federal Reserve Chairman's wife. Not these activist approaches that promise rapid change without understanding how democratic institutions actually function. How democratic institutions actually function. Our transparency research had revealed exactly how those institutions functioned when oversight mechanisms failed, but algorithmic corruption detection apparently seemed less substantial than committee appointments and regulatory networking. Rachel would learn so much from observing tonight's policy discussions, Diana suggested hopefully to the assembled political elite. Seeing how real reform develops through careful relationship building rather than these confrontational transparency tactics that alienate potential allies. Confrontational transparency tactics. Through the service area's industrial windows, I could see an unusual security presence developing around the Kennedy Center. Motorcade preparations and Secret Service positioning that suggested someone requiring presidential-level protection was arriving ahead of schedule. Diana's engagement to the Deputy Attorney General represents exactly the kind of strategic alliance that creates meaningful policy influence, Mom was explaining to Senator Collins's chief of staff. Understanding how to work within existing power structures rather than challenging them through these amateur research organizations. Amateur research organizations. My phone rang insistently, Senator Elizabeth Warren calling directly. Rachel, we've just received your healthcare lobbying report. The president wants an immediate briefing before tonight's healthcare reform announcement. Can you meet us at the motorcade? Senator, I'm actually at the gala. My family doesn't know about our working relationship. Your family doesn't know you've been providing the corruption research that's driving half our legislative agenda? Her confusion was obvious. They think I'm not ready for serious political engagement. Too idealistic and confrontational for Washington networking. Rachel, your Justice Analytics reports have resulted in 14 congressional investigations and 4 major healthcare reform bills. The president specifically requested your analysis before tonight's policy announcement. Through the service windows, I could see the presidential motorcade arriving with full security protocol, the kind of coordinated presence that transformed routine political galas into major policy announcements. Rachel's so fortunate to observe tonight's gathering, Dad was telling anyone within earshot. Real governmental influence requires understanding how legitimate power actually functions in Washington. Not these grassroots organizations that think research papers can change established political systems. Established political systems. In 10 minutes, those systems were about to encounter the research organization that had been changing them through evidence rather than networking. The Kennedy Center's elegant networking was interrupted by President Biden walking directly through the main entrance, accompanied by the Vice President, Senate Majority Leader, and several cabinet members whose presence transformed the gala into an impromptu policy summit. Ladies and gentlemen, the gala coordinator announced with obvious shock. We're honored by this unexpected presidential visit to tonight's gathering. The ballroom fell into respectful silence as America's highest government officials surveyed the assembled crowd, clearly seeking someone specific rather than engaging in routine political pleasantries. We're looking for Rachel Morrison, President Biden announced clearly to the stunned audience. Justice Analytics founder. We understand she was attending tonight's event. Rachel Morrison. The name echoed across the Kennedy Center as 300 political elite tried to identify whoever had earned personal attention from the president and his senior staff. My family's confident political positioning crumbled into horrified confusion as they realized the highest levels of government were seeking the daughter they'd hidden in service areas because she supposedly lacked sophisticated political understanding. Rachel's not. She's not prepared for this level of. Dad stammered weakly. Rachel's corruption research has driven our healthcare reform agenda for the past 2 years, Senator Warren interrupted diplomatically, stepping forward with the president's entourage. Her Justice Analytics reports exposed the pharmaceutical lobbying schemes we're announcing legislation to address tonight. Pharmaceutical lobbying schemes. While my family had been celebrating Diana's engagement to deputy-level officials, I'd been exposing the corruption that threatened democratic institutions at their foundation. Where is Rachel? Vice President Harris asked with growing urgency. We need her healthcare industry analysis for the president's reform announcement. Her research is essential to tomorrow's congressional hearing. I emerged from the service area's side entrance, still carrying the laptop containing files that had exposed millions in illegal pharmaceutical lobbying payments to congressional representatives. "Mr. President," I said calmly, walking toward the podium where my family had positioned themselves for optimal political photography, "I'm here." Though my family felt I wasn't quite ready for serious policy engagement. The silence was absolute as America's highest government officials turned to observe the family dynamics that had hidden their most trusted corruption researcher behind kitchen equipment during Washington's most important political gathering. Their shame had indeed become mine, but not in the way they'd anticipated. The aftermath was immediate and nationally visible. Within hours, every major news outlet was covering the president's surprise healthcare reform announcement, featuring my Justice Analytics research while my family stood bewildered in the background as presidential staff coordinated policy briefings around the Gala's catering tables. Diana's engagement to the Deputy Attorney General became complicated when her fiancé's colleagues discovered she'd spent months dismissing her sister as not ready, while that sister was providing corruption research that exposed his department's regulatory failures. Her political networking achievements became reminders of missed opportunities for meaningful reform advocacy. Dad's FTC advisory position required awkward explanations when fellow commissioners realized he'd been hiding his family connection to the transparency organization that had exposed regulatory capture in 3 federal agencies. His theories about traditional political processes seemed misguided after the president personally retrieved his daughter from service areas. Mom's Washington social climbing collapsed when political wives discovered the Morrisons had systematically underestimated their most influential family member. 6 months later, Justice Analytics had expanded to monitor corruption across 12 federal agencies. My family learned to speak differently about my work. Not because they understood data analysis any better, but because dismissing presidential advisors made them look foolish rather than politically sophisticated.